Welcome to What Drives You with your host, Mike Gourdet. Human solution consultant from Seattle, Washington. It is now time to sit back, buckle up for the show that drives the asking question of what drives you. And now your host, Mike Gourdet.
And welcome to this week's episode of What Drives You, the show about why we do the things we do. I'm your host, Mike Gourdet, right out of Seattle, Washington, where we are enjoying a nice sunny day. Today's episode, we're going to be talking with Elise Pearce, who is from New Orleans, Louisiana. She's going to talk to us a little bit about her journey from occupational therapist to coach. Then we're going to talk on our main segment about introverts versus extroverts. And then finally, the question of the day today is, why do we like to gossip? So just stick around. We'll be right back with Elise. And welcome to this week's interview. Today, we're talking with Elise Pearce, and she's in Louisiana, New Orleans. Hi, Elise. How are you doing today?
Hi, Mike. I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Not a problem at all. I keep cutting you off. That's not a good thing. All right. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'm going to shut up.
Okay. So I have been an occupational therapist for about, I guess, either right at 9 years or a little over 9 years now. Love that. That's been a hugely rewarding career. And then most recently, so in the past year, I started working as a holistic health and self-love coach, which sounds a little different sometimes, but I'm just going with it.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, which part?
Well, you said holistic health and self-love. So give me an idea of where you came up with that title.
So I have had multiple autoimmune conditions since before I was a year old. Guess we'll just jump into that. I wasn't supposed to make it a teenager without being dependent on a wheelchair. I did. And then in my 20s again, was diagnosed again with chronic debilitating conditions. Said I wouldn't be walking much longer, but I've kind of beat the odds, to say the least. And I'm an OT, so like medicine is in my blood. Like my parents were in the medical field. I knew it, right, growing up, because I was always in doctor's offices, and I was like, I know I'm going to be in healthcare. And traditional medicine kind of failed me. Like, I hate to put it that way, but if I'm being blunt, it wasn't working. So I started looking at all of the alternative approaches and really having to treat myself as a whole person, mind, body, spirit, and using some strategies that sound a little goofy, but all combined apparently have worked. Been prescription free for multiple years now. So I have that background for the holistic health approach. And then I learned through my journey that when you have these limitations in your life, whether they be physical or mental, because anxiety came later in my life, they really can impact the way you, I guess, identify your worth, like how you feel like you're deserving of all the other good things in the world, or deserving of a partner or a family, or a leadership position at work. And so that was a very big battle that I had to overcome on my own. And then I got more comfortable asking those questions with my patients in OT world, and learned that that's a big problem, the self-love area for women of all ages. From, I guess I don't work with pediatrics, so from early adult all the way through geriatrics. I mean, I have some private clients now in their 70s and 80s working on these things. And I was just like, I don't want I don't want all these women waiting until they're 70 or 80 to finally feel like they're deserving of love and appreciation and feel like they bring value. So here I am.
All right.
Yeah.
That's great. So would that be, I'm just going to go ahead and ask that first question then, is that what you're really passionate about? Or is that sort of a combined passion? What is your passion? What are you really passionate about?
That's a great question. And I would say, that compassion, I hope that's not too generic, but it's probably my greatest passion. I'm going to try not to get teary-eyed here, but even as a kid, to see strangers in healthcare be so loving to someone they don't know,
Mm-hmm.
like that was impactful. And I felt that. And that's what I want to give back. And I want to do that wherever I can do best. Right.
Right.
Medical field, I mean, I walk the walk. So I'm able to give empathy there to my clients that not all of my coworkers can, right? If you've been healthy your entire life. And then also in the self-love journey, like I've walked that path too. So I feel like I have honestly, I felt like called, like it was time to start doing that.
Okay.
So, not to say that calling won't shift into something new, as the years go on, but this is where I am today.
Who knows? As we get older, we change a little bit, So you talked about compassion, and that's a huge piece, actually, for everybody. Self-compassion, right? Being a very high priority. Well, it's not a high priority for most people because we're not really taught that, but it is a high priority for health, is self-compassion, right? Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So what do you think drives that in you? What is it? You said it was a calling. What do you think drives that?
Well, every time, I guess you'd say I have a flare up, right? Or it's ironic to have spent so many years of my life feeling miserable,
Mm-hmm.
and then to feel good for a long time, and it's funny how quickly you forget how miserable you were. So to have those reminders come up about where I was, that kind of drives me, I guess, because it keeps me remembering what that felt like and how awful that was, to put it bluntly. And to keep people from feeling that way. So
Yeah.
that question.
Huh?
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you're doing fine. So we're, I think as human beings, we often have that purpose. We have needs for growth and we have needs for contribution, but I think we stifle it a lot of the times. But it's funny that it's often the pain in our lives that creates the change to positive outlooks.
Absolutely.
Change comes through that pain. We don't want to suffer, but we will until we suffer enough. And then we decide, okay, well, we're done suffering. And now I'm going to change this in my life. And it sounds like that is one of the primary drivers. What is about helping others get through that drives you?
Well, so you may relate as a coach, but exactly what you just said, you almost have to hit rock bottom before you decide it's time for change.
Mm-hmm.
So my goal is to help as many people before they hit rock bottom, and then help the ones who have too as well. But just to kind of advocate and tell my story to help people hopefully open their eyes and not have to wait till they hit rock bottom. But I'm in the medical field and I'm I will admit that I had to hit rock bottom. So that might be an unrealistic, but still worth striving for goal.
Yeah, I don't know if that's unrealistic or not, but you're right about the rock bottom piece. A lot of people can only make a change. In fact, from a psychological perspective, when we talk about addiction, that's one of the reasons why people decide to actually become sober, is because the pain that they suffer because of the addiction becomes so much greater than what they get from imbibing in that addiction. You know what I mean? So the medicative parts of the addiction is, if I'm an alcoholic, I drink to suppress my pain or to medicate my pain. And that is a powerful, powerful thing until the pain of the consequences of my addiction becomes greater than the pleasure of medicating the pain that I'm trying to medicate. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because that's what change is, right? You're moving from the familiar uncomfortable to the unfamiliar uncomfortable.
Right. And that's what I talk about quite a bit when I talk about the greatest fears of the human being is the fear of the unknown. And from an interpersonal, it would be fear of rejection. So we have to face two things when we're trying to make a change. We have to face an unknown, which is a very scary, very primal fear that we have. And we have to face possible rejection from the people around us that support us in our problem areas. Would that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Those articles, those why you shouldn't care about what other people think, drive me nuts, because we're like very much so social creatures.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Wired.
Those, I find those to be very it's all based around what I call a perfection paradigm. We have in our modern society, we have this sort of concept of perfection that is fostered on us. And you mentioned it earlier, and I asked you about it, is you said that you found when you were doing your occupational therapy, you found that people were coming in and there was this hush hush topic of anxiety. And I asked you what that meant. And what did you say?
That it's hush hush, because if you meet someone new, or even if you're friends with someone for years, like you having anxiety will quite possibly never come up in conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's typical of our media driven society, right? So if you we're bombarded every day, all day, with what we have to be in order to be successful, in order to be dateable, in order to be liked. Everybody, the Crest commercials, the Tide commercials, every commercial on TV is all designed around this idea of you projecting an image of perfection. And we do that all day long on Instagram and Facebook. And what do we show people? What we show people our successes, and we show people this sort of ideal life. Look at me, I got everything under control. And that's just not the case for anybody. And I get really irritated by some of these tropes in the coaching industry about one of them is what you mentioned, to not care what other people thinks, because that's impossible. Some of the others are this personal growth becoming this perfectionistic look at ourselves. Positivity is one. There's nothing wrong with being positive, but this sort of positivity ideal is impossible to get, right?
Absolutely, where it excludes the facts that every human being will experience all the range of the emotions. I mean, even the unpleasant ones all throughout their life.
Yeah.
And you doesn't mean you're not positive or you're not an optimistic person.
Right, right. So, this whole conversation about hitting rock bottom, I think, is very important, because that's where I think we have to get to sometimes before we actually do things. Or somehow we convince our primal brain that what we need to have is more is much better than the pain that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I feel like you talked about advertisements, especially beauty products and whatnot. It's all like, you're not good enough unless you have this, right? That's how they kind of win us over.
Yeah, we are all suffering from some sort of dysmorphia when it comes to who we are supposed to be, how we're supposed to act, what we're supposed to look like. All the and it gets complicated when we start pulling in the political pieces too, where we talk about political correctness and what that means, and the ideas behind it, and these very strange ideals of who it is we are as a culture or as a society. And that's an interesting way that we create all this anxiety. Because I got to tell you, women aren't the only ones that suffer from this stuff all the time. Men suffer from anxiety like crazy, but because it's a bad thing, we're taught to shut up about it. We're taught to cowboy up, right? We're taught to, you might be very familiar with that term. I don't know.
Yes, I have heard it a time or two.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I will touch on, I've had a few men ask to, like, I have this Facebook group where I give a lot of content, to join my group, and then even ask why I don't work with men.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that I don't feel like men also have anxiety and trouble with self-worth and self-love, but going back to that calling or your purpose or your passion, I just felt personally that I can help and relate to women, especially someone new to this kind of coaching realm, like dipping into this new, like that, just, I felt like women were the group that I could really, where I felt confident, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that really help them and show them kind of a roadmap. But yeah, it's not to belittle the men out there with similar issues.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's an interesting time that we live in, where we continually talk about being in touch with ourselves, but we continually lie to ourselves, and we place that out into our world. If I want to go to a job interview, I have to project a sense of confidence and perfection that will be profitable to another company. Or if I am a business person, I have to go out and project this confidence that I have all the answers, right? And it's the same thing with the medical community. I'm sure you can vouch for that, right?
Yeah, our mask, as I know you've referred to it before. Yeah, my professional mask comes on when I'm at work. All any unpleasant feelings I might be feeling have to be put aside so that I can be there.
Right. And we have this proliferation of being scared that if we make a mistake, it's going to hammer us financially or whatever. So, we're very taught by our society how to be a perfection person, and we all succumb to it because, environment is one of the greatest predictors of behavior. So,
our check boxes, if you will, right?
Yes, our check boxes. Do I have my hair combed, or, if I have hair? Do I have my teeth brushed? Do I have my whitening strips? Do I have my clothes cleaned by the proper laundry soap? Do I have the proper accent right?
I see where you're getting with this. Yes.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I have mixed feelings about that, Mike. So I have a feeling you're hinting for a story I shared with you earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. So I came from a very Cajun family, very Cajun background in Louisiana. Grew up right along a bayou. Grew up in Piros, hunting, fishing, crawfishing since I was a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently had a strong accent. And then went to college, and my professors knew I wanted to pursue a graduate degree. And two of them, after having apparently a meeting with others, pulled me aside to let me know that they felt that if I wanted to pursue a graduate program, that I needed to tone down my accent.
Right.
Whew. And that I was so self-conscious, like I had never crossed my mind before. That just wasn't in my, I don't know, it wasn't a checkbox, have the correct or have a lack of accent. But yeah, so then I got really self-conscious about it. And then I would spend my summers of college working at a sports camp in Massachusetts. So around people from all over the world, and a lot of Northerners who I'd hear them make their comments about Southerners. And and you pointed out about how it's kind of assumptions are made about your intelligence when you have that Southern accent come through.
Yeah. We have, and this is not a cultural thing too. If you remember the movie My Fair Lady, I don't know if you ever saw that. I'm a little dating myself a little bit, but My Fair Lady is based in this idea that this is British etiquette, right? That he took this woman out of the dregs of London society and created this highborn lady out of her, right? Because the views are based around these judgments that we create around certain things. And I shared with you too that I'm from the South too, and anytime I go and visit, I pick it up really quick. And when I come home, it's like 2 weeks that I'm twanging away like you can't believe. And it's an interesting thing. Nobody has ever told me what you experienced. Nobody's ever pulled me aside and said, hey, you know, that accent that you got going on is going to make you look stupid. But I've heard of that before, you know, and I've studied that kind of stuff. But it's an interesting dynamic that we still place a lot of that judgment on things like accents, and we do it with other cultures too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and both sets of grandparents, my grandparents, their first language was French. Well, Cajun French, not correct, politically correct French. But so I grew up, I remember them wanting to teach us French, and I could understand it much better than I could speak it. But they would tell the stories of how when they were in school, if they spoke French, they'd get slapped on the hand with a ruler. You were not allowed to speak French. So I guess when I heard that from my professors, I was just like, oh, you know, I should have known this. Like I was wrong for not having known already, you know?
Right. All right. Well, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. I mean, we could talk about this stuff forever. I love this kind of stuff, but we're nearing the end of our time frame. I know that when we talked at first, I asked you if you had a question. Do you want to ask that question, or do you want to pass on that?
Sure. I'm open to asking it.
Okay. What was your question?
So my question for you, as a human solutions consultant, and I know you work with high performers, I consider myself to be a high performer.
Mm-hmm.
One question I'll say for you another day is what makes someone identify as a high performer. But for now, I was told as a child, like growing up, like people would be like, "Oh, it's amazing to me how fear doesn't stop you." And I never really fully understood what that meant because I guess I didn't see the fear. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I ended up experiencing anxiety and panic attacks as I got older. And you actually asked me a question, I don't know, within the last few years, just randomly before we really knew each other well, and then I started following you. But you asked what changed, like when did anxiety start, and how did you think differently before versus now? And that really made me reflect. And I was like, oh, I do see things more as I do have more fears now versus before. I think it was always like a challenge. I was always going to be the exception.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think leads to that transition in life that could happen under our noses where we lose that mindset of it's a challenge versus it's a fear and I should stay away?
I think a portion of that is high performers are typically rewarded for their behavior, right? So what we learn is that there is an extrinsic reward system that's going on, and that's pride from our family, pride from our teachers, and things like that, right? So as we're brought up through grade school and high school, and this is one of the things that I experienced, was that if you put me in a school setting, I'm fine. I thrive like crazy, right? And that's because that's how I was rewarded. So I got all the support growing up to being smart or being a good student. And then what happens is that once we get out into the world, we get less and less of that. So we're looking for that validation, and we're not getting it. All we're now getting is why aren't you doing this, or why isn't this happening, from our bosses or from other coworkers and things like that. So we start questioning ourselves, and we start thinking, what's going on here? And because we don't really process that out and understand where we got that from, that we start to take on this attitude where we're like, oh my God, I'm not the bee's knees like I always thought I was. And so we try harder. And as we try harder, we fall harder, or we fail harder. And so we set up a system of perfectionism in how we go about trying to get these things. So I don't think it's necessarily an unusual topic to be really fearless as we're younger, and as we get older, we start to get a reality check that a lot of our stuff, all of that stuff, was supported around us in a way that helped us understand that there was nothing to fear when we were younger. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when you're an adult, when you're adulting, things don't often go the right way, and in school, all you had to do was the right thing, right? You just had to get the right test score, and everything was great, and people lauded you and gave you awards. And if you were a science fair geek, you would win the science fair, or get scholarships to go to college. And I missed out on a really good opportunity to go to an Ivy League school, and I didn't take it. And that traps you in this. Well, you screwed up, son. You screwed up. And at some point we keep looking for the validation, and we're not getting it. And I think that's probably where this idea comes from, where you have to not care what people think, because it's an envelope it's a very nice envelope for denying things and keeping us safe. Well, if I don't care what anybody thinks, then I can't feel like I'm a failure. But it's too late. I already feel like a failure.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Does that sound like a good answer?
Yeah. I'll qualify it as a good answer for you, Mike.
Thanks for validating me. I appreciate that.
I was so physical limitations as a kid, right? So my self-love journey had me reflect back, and I totally put a lot of my identity into I was a smart kid, always top of my class presidents, presidents of honor societies, leadership roles all throughout. Yeah, we lose even with leadership positions at work, those dopamine spikes without those report cards, right? Our tests, we don't get those dopamine spikes nearly as often, but we still go after it all.
Right. And I think that's where we start to redefine that identity piece, where suddenly we're not getting what we thought we had, and one of the harshest things is that we start believing it. We start to believe that, okay, we suck. And you might have had that as a child too, which, is a traumatic experience, which is one of the things that drives high performers too, is that people have always told them that they aren't good enough. So they strive to be better than what people think they are. And they can never get that. They can never get that satisfaction with themselves, because when we look at this idea of performance, there's always a better thing that we can do. There's always something that we can do better. And if we don't get that, we start putting these impossible goals out there. We just ran the 4-minute mile and we can't be satisfied with it because we now know that we can run a 3-minute mile or whatever. And so we beat ourselves up. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful way of plummeting into the deep pit.
Yeah. So some of my homework still to this day is celebrating all of those little steps along the way, right? Because you do get caught up in what you could be, and you forget to. In fact, right before coming on with you, I'm actually so I'm a yoga teacher as well, but I went back to this old beginner's yoga course, because I was like, sometimes it's good just to go back and see what all you missed whenever you were learning the big picture, right? And I was hearing all these details, and just to get into some of these positions that I was telling my husband were miserable. I was so mad that I even had to try them, and I'm fussing the girl on the screen because I'm like, this is impossible. And now I'm like, oh yes, like we're about to do this one. Like that's comforting for me. And I'm just like, what a great reminder before this podcast even, right? Because having those uncomfortable situations just become more familiar. Some people become less uncomfortable.
Absolutely. We always forget what practicing we did, right?
Where how far we were just a year ago, even sometimes, but we keep looking ahead. So we're away from that finish line if we keep looking there.
Yes. Yeah.
Keep moving the finish line.
What was that?
Keep moving the finish line. I know that's a tendency I have.
Yeah, that's a high performer thing, is that when we're it's really rife. If you look in the career field or the career advancement field, that's always the thing. It's like, well, when you get a goal, don't worry about it, just set a new goal. Just get to your next goal. So you're always reaching for the next goal. You're never experiencing the fundamental pleasure of actually reaching that goal. And we've gotten to this point where we actually suffer some depression when we actually reach a goal, because we've put so much energy into that, and we get the goal and there's nothing, just like this, there's no revelation, right? There's no fireworks, there's no validation. And so we plummet into a sense, and everybody's sort of prescription is to, oh, well, just set another goal. Okay, that's like drinking another glass of beer because you're still feeling the pain.
Yeah. So I think what was huge for me was looking back and realizing I was trying to earn value and worth, right? With all this goal meeting or goal setting for higher goals. And now to have to separate that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And
It's because I want to, not because I should or I have to or I need to, but just because I want to.
Right. Yeah. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will leave it at that. I hope that answers your question adequately. There's a lot more dynamics that go into that, but that's one of the basic principles of that question. Anyway, that's all we have for today. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking time out to talk about your passion and what you think drives that.
Well, I'm very grateful that you had me on. Thank you for that. I enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Well, I will certainly see you on Facebook, I'm sure. And then for the rest of you, please stick around. We'll be right back with our main segment. Thank you very much. And welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about introverts versus extroverts. I know there's some confusion about that term. I hear it all the time. Introversion versus extroversion. If I'm an introvert, then I'm this way. If I'm an extrovert, then I'm that way. What we are talking about is aspects of personality. And these are concepts that were provided to us by Carl Jung originally. And what that technically means is that extroverts tend to focus outside of themselves on relationships, and introverts tend to be more inward focused. Now, this over time has come to mean some different things, and what we found throughout the last many years is that it comes down to a basic generation of energy. So, typically speaking, if you're extroverted, you tend to get energized around other people. So you gain energy from being around other people. And with an introvert, you tend to lose energy when you're around other people, and then you gain it from being by yourself. So typical behaviors from an extroverted point of view, from an introverted point of view, if you're an extrovert, you tend to like to be outside with other people. You tend to have a lot of relationships that you enjoy engaging in. You tend to be associated with things like gregariousness and things like that. And introversion, the tendency is for them to have less relationships with other people. They tend to spend more time alone doing work like, well, reading, reflecting, things like that. So there is this. Now there's some common misconceptions about things about like shyness. Introverts tend to be labeled shy, when shy is a different thing. You can have shy extroverts. Shyness is an anxiety-based behavior in regards to other people. And it doesn't mean that if you're introvert, you're shy. What it means is that you have anxiety around other people. You can still be extroverted and be shy. And you could probably argue that you could be introverted and gregarious. You can enjoy speaking. So how does this create some confusion? Well, a lot of people think you're either or, and that's really not the case. Now, there's two predominant theories that we live on a spectrum, which is the first theory, and that I think that's the most, it's probably the most widely thought of, is that you live on a spectrum, and the further out on that spectrum you get, you are more deeply embedded in that behavior. So there's extroversion and then there's introversion. And in the middle is where you have traits of both, or you are more neutral, I guess, in terms of what you are. That's become known as ambiverts. So that means they could switch back and forth. And the second really predominant theory is that you're basically both. You can be introverted and you can be extroverted. And who knows exactly which one is correct? I just know for myself that I am typically introverted. I like to spend a lot of time alone. When I'm with other people, while I enjoy being with other people, I do get tired very quickly. And I tend to be more reflective. But I do things that people sort of get surprised about. Like, I enjoy public speaking, and that's something that a lot of people don't like to do. Again, we're talking about an attitude or a behavior or something that's assigned to something that we have associated. So instead of being shy, I would be out there, enjoying something that most people don't like, which is public speaking. So there's a lot of variations, and we consider that to be a very extroverted thing. Getting up in front of people and talking, we consider to be an extroverted thing. And we can typically look at this through the workplace. The workplace, or our modern day of working, tends to be extroverted in preference. We congregate in places, we deal with other people all day long, and then we go out to our home and do this. And in many realms today, we're seeing things like open office spaces that are becoming more difficult for people who are more introverted to exist in, because there's too many distractions, and it creates a place where it's very uncomfortable for people who are more introverted to exist in. It's an interesting sort of a sociological look at it as we move from the agrarian to the industrial revolution, and from the industrial revolution to where we are now as the information age. If you think about it, as an agrarian society, we were all probably pretty introverted, not necessarily by choice, but because we were isolated on our farms and things like that. So there may be some conjunction to that, but I don't know. That's something to think about. But as we move into the industrial revolution, we see more conglomerations of people being placed in close proximity to each other. And the natural tendency is to start separating yourself, right? So the natural tendency for extroverts is to group up, and the natural tendency for introverts is to sort of move off to the side. And we can see this in groups, in terms of dynamics too. When you see a lot of people like, let's say a party, you will expect to find the extroverts in the center, or integrating, or acting in areas where they are conglomerating, and then out on the edges, you're more likely to see the introverts. Now, does this mean that introverts hate people? No, it doesn't. Actually, everybody needs everybody else. We need people. An introvert needs relationships. They just don't need the stimulation that comes with a lot of external behaviors, external engagements. So from an introverted point of view, if I need some human interaction, I can go to a bar, or let's say a movie theater, and watch a movie, and I can sort of get human engagement just from being around other people. I don't actually have to engage with people directly, whereas extroverts tend to want to directly engage with other people. And like I was saying earlier, our workplace our industrial complex or tends to be more extroverted in general. If you think about the way we engage in business and we engage in office politics and things like that, we tend to have a more extroverted idea. And what can be difficult is like the hiring and onboarding process for employees is very extroverted. We have to go to an interview, we have to interact directly with people, and then those people have to decide whether we are a good fit and then we have to decide whether we're a good fit, and then we move that process into the greater group or move on to the next job interview. So it's very much performance based, which can be very uncomfortable for introverts who don't necessarily desire that interaction. They may be great at something, but they don't want to have to talk about how great they are, or they don't want to have to talk to somebody about why they should be hired. So it's a very, again, these are very complicated situations that I'm trying to sort of suss out a little bit. So the representations that I'm using aren't necessarily the best way of saying it or the best way of understanding it. It's just a model for understanding what's going on. So these 2 points come up quite a bit when I'm talking to other people and things like that. And we just have to remember that just because we are extroverts doesn't mean we're certain ways. Just because we're introverts doesn't mean we're certain ways. There are traits that we sort of, and these go into our personalities. Our personalities are basically persistent behavior reflections of ourselves, if you will. So I don't know where you are. I consider myself, I always often say I'm a terminal introvert because I tend to spend a lot of time by myself. Again, it doesn't mean that I don't want other relationships, because I do. I need that connection just like every other human being does. I just don't need it as much. It doesn't energize me as much as it does with an extrovert. Until you get me out on a stage, then I get very energized, which is funny, but then I crash really hard later. So it's a payoff. So that may not be the simplest way of saying it, but we all tend towards one or the other. We have a tendency towards being extroverted or a tendency towards being introverted, whether you think along the terms of that continuum scale or just interchangeably. And different situations, of course, call for different behaviors. So we have learned to adapt to different ways over time. Going back to the work analogy, an introvert going into an office setting, they adapt to that office setting, and they can probably be pretty, or perceived anyway, as extroverted in that particular realm or in that particular area. But when they go to, say, I don't know, a dinner party or maybe a get together afterwards, they suddenly revert back into that introversion and feel uncomfortable because the environment has changed. The environment is one of the biggest factors for our behavior in the first place. So it really can work in our advantage in some ways and in our disadvantage in other ways, because it's easy to adapt to a certain environment because that's how we are as humans. Humans adapt to whatever environment they're in. And if you don't believe me, just look out your window and see how many people are wearing masks. I know this is a big political issue, but there is adaptation going on around us. And when things change, let's assume for a moment that this COVID stuff goes away and that we don't have to worry about it anymore. You'll see us readapt to what we consider normal, right? And that's the idea with how we just don't like change. We want something to remain the same, and arguably we could say that if these things that we are doing now continue on for a longer period of time, let's say 5 years. I know, don't get upset with me. Let's say 5 years, 10 years down the road, that the norm will become these things, and it will be uncomfortable for us to shift back to a certain way because over time we will adapt to this situation and it will become normal. Okay, so don't get upset with me. I'm just reporting how we are. And that's how we can engage in introverted and extroverted activities, even if we're introverted or extroverted. Extroverts can sit down and read a book just as easily as an introvert does, but they probably will not read it as long, or they may do it for a sedative and put themselves to sleep. So that's sort of a big picture view of introverted versus extroverted. We're going to move on to our next topic here in just a moment, and that's why do we gossip? So just stick around. We'll be right back. So the question of the day is, why do we gossip? And believe it or not, that's a more complicated answer than we might think. Now, what I'm guessing the intent for this question is that we have a connotation of gossip being completely negative, right? So that's what I was talking. We talked about the power of words. That's one of these ideas that proliferate because of a word. When I say gossip, most people will think in terms of negative reaction. Okay, so why do we gossip? Well, in the intent for which that question is probably put forth, why do we gossip? There are a couple of different reasons. One is we're human beings. We're very social animals, but we're also hierarchical in nature, meaning we all look for where we fit in society, and some people don't like where they are. Some people don't like where other people are. So negative gossip is a way of making ourselves feel better about how we are as people. Now, this is based in a common response called envy. You know, we envy other people's positions, we envy other people's possessions, looks, whatever. And what happens is, if we can't meet those needs for ourselves, if I look at this is where the term keep up with the Joneses comes into play. If I look at my neighbor and I see that they have a brand new car out in front and I'm envious of that, I may go try to buy a brand new car. And if I can't do that, I'm going to downplay theirs. So I may say something like, well, that's just a Ford or a Chevy. They can't even afford to get a real quality car or whatever. So I'm going to put them down. And the minute I start engaging in that behavior, I am making myself feel better by bringing those people down in my perceptual field. So when we talk about negative gossip, we're talking about doing that wholesale. We're talking about bringing people down to a level that we can feel better, and we're going to socialize that so that other people can conform to that thought, right? So we're going to be putting it out there for everybody else so that they can feel better about themselves. Or we can find the people who we can separate out of that little group formation about whoever that is. Again, we like people who are like ourselves. So if we engage in gossip together, we are actually forming social bonds. And that's actually one of the other reasons for gossip, regardless of if it's negative, positive, or neutral, because there are negative, positive, and neutral gossip going out there, right? It's not exclusively negative. But in all cases, when we are engaging in gossip, we are actually forming social bonds through the telling of this story. And stories are very important to human beings, and it's one of the formations of culture. So we are essentially socially bonding with people. And if we're engaging in negative gossip, we are, as a group formation, we are bringing somebody down so that we can collectively feel better about ourselves. And this is how you get into, like the boss is a jerk kind of conversations, or guess who I saw downtown standing on a street corner kind of thing. There's just a very complex system going on of social bonding and trying to get together and feel better about ourselves, and really we are trying to, again, we're still trying to find our places. We're looking for our place in that group, in that fit, in that culture, in that society, and whatever it is. That is a couple of the reasons why we engage in gossip. I hope that answers your question. I'm pretty sure you meant negativity, but again, it's a little more, it's always, all this stuff is a little bit more complicated than what it seems, which is funny if you think about it. So thanks again. Appreciate that. If you do have some questions, please let me know. Write me at mike@whatdrivesyou.net, or, comment on a video or post or anything and let me know what your thoughts are. Thank you for joining us this week. We'll be back again next week. Until then, have a great week. Bye-bye.